Chapter 7 Barring Accident. The morning winds rustled through the grass forest, and closer to hand it pulled at the cloaks of the Salariki. Clan nobles sat on stools, lesser folk squatted on the trampled stubble of the cleared ground outside the stockade. In their many-colored splendor, the drab tunics of the Terrans were a blot of darkness at either end of the makeshift arena which had been marked out for them. At the conclusion of their conference, the Queen's men had been forced into a course Jellicoe had urged from the first. He and he alone would represent the free traders in the coming duel. And now he stood there in the early morning, stripped down to shorts and boots, wearing nothing on which a net could catch and so trap him. The free traders were certain that the IS men, having any advantage, would press it to the ultimate limit, and the death of Captain Jellicoe would make a great impression on the Salariki. Jellicoe was taller than the Izy who faced him, but almost as lean. Hard muscles moved under his skin, pale where the space tan had not burned in the years of his star voyaging. And his every movement was with the liquid grace of a man who, in his time, had been a master of the force blade. Now he gripped in his left hand the claw-knife given him by Groft himself, and in the other he looped the throwing rope of the net. At the other end of the field, the Izy man was industriously moving his boot soles back and forth across the ground, intent upon coating them with as much of the gritty sand as would adhere. And he displayed the supreme confidence in himself which he had shown at the moment of challenge in the great hall. None of the free-trading party made the mistake of trying to give Jellicoe advice. The captain had not risen to his command without learning his duties, and the duties of a free trader covered a wide range of knowledge and practice. One had to be equally expert with a blaster and a slingshot when the occasion demanded. Though Jellicoe had not fought a Salariki duel with net and knife before, he had a deep memory of other weapons, other tactics which could be drawn upon and adapted to his present need. There was none of the casual atmosphere which had surrounded the affair between the Salariki clansmen in the hall. Here was ceremony. The storm priests invoked their own particular grim providence, and there was an oath taken over the weapons of battle. When the actual engagement began, the betting among the spectators had reached, Dane decided, epic proportions. Large sections of Sargolian personal property were due to change hands as a result of this encounter. As the chief priest gave the order to engage, both Terrans advanced from their respective ends of the fighting space, with the half-crouching, light-footed tread of spacemen. Jellicoe had pulled his net into as close a resemblance to rope as its bulk would allow. The very type of weapon, so far removed from any the traders knew, made it a disadvantage rather than an asset. But it was when the Izy moved out to meet the captain that Rip's fingers closed about Dane's upper arm in an almost paralyzing grip. "He knows." Dane had not needed that bad news to be made vocal. Having seen the exploits of the Salariki duelist earlier, he had already caught the significance of that glide, of the way the IS champion carried his net. The Izy had not had any last-minute instruction in the use of Sargolian weapons. He had practiced, and by his stance knew enough to make him a formidable menace. The clamor about the Queen's party rose as the battle-wise eyes of the clansmen noted that, and the odds against Jellicoe reached fantastic heights, while the hearts of his crew sank. Only Van Ryck was not disturbed. Now and then he raised his smelling bottle to his nose, with an elegant gesture which matched those of the befurred nobility around him, as if not a thought of care ruffled his mind. The Izy feinted in an opening which was a rather ragged copy of the young Salarik's more fluid move some hours before. But when the net settled, Jellicoe was simply not there. His quick drop to one knee had sent the mesh flailing in an arc over his bowed shoulders, with a good 6 inches to spare. And a cry of approval came not only from his comrades, but from those natives who had been gamblers enough to venture their wagers on his performance. Dane watched the field and the fighters through a watery film. The discomfort he had experienced since downing that mouthful of the cup of friendship had tightened into a fist of pain clutching his middle in a torturing grip. But he knew he must stick it out until Jellicoe's ordeal was over. Someone stumbled against him, and he glanced up to see Ollie's face, a horrible gray-green under the tan, close to his own. For a moment the engineer apprentice caught at his arm for support, and then, with a visible effort, straightened up. So he wasn't the only one. He looked for Rip and Weeks, and saw that they, too, were ill. But for a moment all that mattered was the stretch of trampled earth and the two men facing each other. The Eisy made another cast, and this time, although Jellicoe was not caught, the slap of the mesh raised a red welt on his forearm. So far the captain had been content to play the defensive role of retreat, studying his enemy, planning ahead. The Eisy plainly thought the game was his, that he had only to wait for a favorable moment and cinch the victory. Dane began to think it had gone on for weary hours, and he was dimly aware that the Salariki were also restless. One or two shouted angrily at Jellicoe in their own tongue. The end came suddenly. Jellicoe lost his footing, stumbled, and went down, but before his men could move, the Eisy champion bounded forward, his net whirling out. Only he never reached the captain. In the very act of falling, Jellicoe had pulled his legs under him so that he was not supine but crouched, and his net swept at the ground level, clipping the IS man about the shins, entangling his feet so that he went crashing heavily to the sod and lay still. The whip! That Lalok's whip trick! Wilcox's voice rose triumphantly above the babble of the crowd. Using his net as if it had been a thong, Jellicoe had brought down the Eisy with a move the other had not foreseen. Breathing hard, sweat running down his shoulders and making tracks through the powdery red dust which streaked him, Jellicoe got to his feet and walked over to the IS champion, who had not moved or made a sound since his fall. The captain went down on one knee to examine him. "Kill! Kill!" That was the Salariki, all their instinctive savagery aroused. But Jellicoe spoke to Groft. "By our customs we do not kill the conquered. Let his friends bear him hence." He took the claw knife the Eisy still clutched in his hand and thrust it into his own belt. Then he faced the IS party and Callie. "Take your man and get out." The rein he had kept on his temper these past days was growing very thin. "You've made your last play here." Callie's thick lips drew back in something close to a Salaric snarl. But neither he nor his men made any reply. They bundled up their unconscious fighter and disappeared. Of their own return to the sanctuary of the Queen, Dane had only the dimmest of memories afterwards. He had made the privacy of the forest road before he yielded to the demands of his outraged interior, and after that he had stumbled along with Van Ryck's hand under his arm, knowing from other miserable sounds that he was not alone in his torment. It was some time later, months, he thought when he first roused, that he found himself lying in his bunk, feeling very weak and empty as if a large section of his middle had been removed, but also at peace with his world. As he levered himself up, the cabin had a nasty tendency to move slowly to the right, as if he were a pivot on which it swung, and he had all the sensations of being in free fall, though the Queen was still firmly planeted. But that was only a minor discomfort compared to the disturbance he remembered. Fed the semi-liquid diet prescribed by Tao and served up by Mura to him and his fellow sufferers, he speedily got back his strength. But it had been a close call. He did not need Tao's explanation to underline that. Weeks had suffered the least of the four, he the most, though none of them had had an easy time, and they had been out of circulation 3 days. "The IZ blasted last night," Rip informed him as they lounged in the sun on the ramp, sharing the blessed lazy hours of invalidism. But somehow that news gave Dane no lift of spirit. "I didn't think they'd give up." Rip shrugged. "They may be off to make a dust-off before the board. Only thanks to Van and the old man, we're covered all along the line. There's nothing they can use against us to break our contract. And now we're in so solid they can't cut us out with the Salariki. Groft asked the captain to teach him that trick with the net. I didn't know the old man knew Laylock's whip fighting. It's about one of the nastiest ways to get cut to pieces in this universe." "How's trade going?" Rip's sunniness clouded. "Supplies have given out. Weeks had an idea, but it won't bring in Koros. That red wood he's so mad about, he's persuaded Van to stow some in the cargo hold since we have enough Koros stones to cover the voyage. Luckily, the clansmen will take ordinary trade goods in exchange for that, and Weeks thinks it will sell on Terra. It's tough enough to turn a steel knife blade, and yet it's light and easy to handle when it's cured. Queer stuff, and the color's interesting. That stockade of it planted around Groff's town has been up to close to 100 years, and not a sign of rot in a log of it." "Where's Van?" "The storm priest sent for him. Some kind of gabble fest on the star level, I gather. Otherwise, we're almost ready to blast. And we know what kind of cargo to bring next time." They certainly did, Dane agreed. But he was not to idle away his morning. An hour later a caravan came out of the forest, a line of complaining, burdened Orgals, their tiny heads hanging low as they moaned their woes, the hard life which sent them on their sluggish way with piles of red logs lashed to their broad-toads' backs. Weeks was in charge of the procession, and Dane went to work with the cargo plan Van had left, seeing that the brilliant scarlet lengths were hoisted into the lower cargo hatch and stacked according to the science of stowage. He discovered that Rip had been right. The wood, for all its incredible hardness, was light of weight. Weak as he still was, he could lift and stow a full-sized log with no great difficulty. And he thought Weeks was correct in thinking that it would sell on their home world. The color was novel, the durability an asset. It would not make fortunes as the Koros stones might, but every bit of profit helped, and this cargo might cover their fielding fees on Terra. Sinbad was in the cargo space when the first of the logs came in. With his usual curiosity, the striped tomcat prowled along the wood, sniffing industriously. Suddenly he stopped short, spat and backed away, his spine fur a roughened crest. Having backed as far as the inner door, he turned and slunk out. Puzzled, Dane gave the wood a swift inspection. There were no cracks or crevices in the smooth surfaces, but as he stopped over the logs, he became conscious of a sharp odor. So this was one scent of the perfumed planet Sinbad did not like. Dane laughed. Maybe they had better have Weeks make a gate of the stuff and slip it across the ramp, keeping Sinbad on shipboard. Odd, it wasn't an unpleasant odor, at least to him it wasn't, just sharp and pungent. He sniffed again, and was vaguely surprised to discover that it was less noticeable now. Perhaps the wood when taken out of the sunlight lost its scent. They packed the lower hold solid, in accordance with the rules of stowage, and locked the hatch before Van Ryck returned from his meeting with the storm priests. When the cargo master came back, he was followed by 2 servants bearing between them a chest. But there was something in Van Ryck's attitude, apparent to those who knew him best, that proclaimed that he was not too well pleased with this morning's work. Sparing the feelings of the accompanying storm priests about the offensiveness of the spacer, Captain Jellicoe and Steen Wilcox went out to receive them in the open. Dane watched from the hatch, aware that in his present pariahhood it would not be wise to venture closer. The Terran traders were protesting some course of action that the Salariki were firmly insistent upon. In the end, the natives won, and Costi was summoned to carry on board the chest which the servants had brought. Having seen it carried safely inside the spacer, the aliens departed, but Van Ryck was frowning, and Jellicoe's fingers were beating a tattoo on his belt as they came up the ramp. "I don't like it," Jellicoe stated as he entered. "It was none of my doing," Van Ryck snapped. "I'll take risks if I have to, but there's something about this one." He broke off, 2 deep lines showing between his thick brows. "Well, you can't teach a Sasseril to spit," he ended philosophically. "We'll have to do the best we can." But Jellicoe did not look at all happy as he climbed to the control section, and before the hour was out, the reason for the captain's uneasiness was common property throughout the ship. Having sampled the delights of off-world herbs, the Salariki were determined to not be cut off from their source of supply. 6 Terran months from the present Sargolian date would come the great yearly feast of the 50 Storms, and the priests were agreed that this year their influence and power would be doubled if they could offer the devout certain privileges in the form of Terran plants. Consequently, they had produced and forced upon the reluctant Van Ryck the Koros collection of their order, with instructions that it be sold on Terra and the price returned to them in the precious seeds and plants. In vain the cargo master and captain had pointed out that galactic trade was a chancy thing at best, that accident might prevent return of the Queen to Sargol. But the priests had remained adamant, and saw in all such arguments only a devious attempt to raise prices. They quoted in their return the information they had levered out of the company men, that traders had their code, and that once pay had been given in advance, the contract must be fulfilled. They, and they alone, wanted the full cargo of the Queen on their next voyage, and they were taking the one way they were sure of achieving that result. So a fortune in Koro stones, which as yet did not rightfully belong to the traders, was now in the Queen's strong-room, and her crew were pledged by the strongest possible tie known in their service to set down on Sargol once more before the allotted time had passed. The free traders did not like it. There was even a vaguely superstitious feeling that such a bargain would inevitably draw ill luck to them. But they were left with no choice if they wanted to retain their influence with the Salariki. "Cutting orbit pretty fine, aren't we?" Allie asked Rip across the mess table. "I saw your 2-star man sweating it out before he came down to shoot the breeze with us rocket monkeys." Rip nodded. "Steen's double-checked every computation, and some he's done 4 times. He ran his hands over his close-cropped head with a weary gesture. As a semi-invalid, he had been herded down with his fellows to swallow the builder Mura had concocted, and Tau insisted that they take, but he had been doing a half a night's work on the plotter under his chief's exacting eye before he came. "The latest news is that, barring accident, we can make it with about 3 weeks' grace, give or take a day or 2. Barring accident. The words rang in the air. Here on the frontiers of the star lanes there were so many accidents, so many delays which could put a ship behind schedule. Only on the main star trails did the huge liners, or company ships, attempt to keep on regularly timed trips. A free trader did not really dare to have an inelastic contract. "What does Stott say?" Dane asked Allie. "He says we can deliver. We don't have the headache about setting a course. You point the nose, and we only have to give her the boost to send her along." Rip sighed. "Yes, point her nose." He inspected his nails. "Goodbye," he added gravely. "These won't be here by the time we plant it here again. I'll have my fingers gnawed off to the first knuckle. Well, we lift at 6 hours. Pleasant strap down." He drank the last of the stuff in his mug, made a face at the flavor, and got to his feet, due back at his post in control. Dane, free of duty until the ship earthed, drifted back to his own cabin, sure of part of a night's undisturbed rest before they blasted off. Sinbad was curled on his bunk. For some reason, the cat had not been prowling the ship before takeoff as he usually did. First he had sat on Van's desk, and now he was here, almost as if he wanted human company. Dane picked him up, and Sinbad rumbled a purr, arching his head so that it rubbed against the young man's chin in an extremely uncharacteristic show of affection. Smoothing the fur along the cat's jawline, Dane carried him back to the cargo master's cabin. With some hesitation, he knocked at the panel, and did not step in until he had Van Ryck's muffled invitation. The cargo master was stretched on the bunk, two of the take-off straps already fastened across his bulk, as if he intended to sleep through the blast-off. "Sinbad, sir. Shall I stow him?" Van Ryck grunted an assent, and Dane dropped the cat in the small hammock which was his particular station, fastening the safety cords. For once Sinbad made no protest, but rolled into a ball and was promptly fast asleep. For a moment or two Dane thought about his unnatural behavior and wondered if he should call it to the cargo master's attention. Perhaps on Sargol Sinbad had had his equivalent of a friendship cup and needed a checkup by Tau. Stowage correct? The question, coming from Van Ryck, was also unusual. The seal would not have been put across the hold lock had its contents not been checked and rechecked. "Yes, sir," Dane replied woodenly, knowing he was still in the outer darkness. "There was just the wood. We stowed it according to chart." Van Ryck grunted once more. "Feeling top layer again?" "Yes, sir. Any orders, sir?" "No. Blast-off's at 6. "Yes, sir." Dane left the cabin, closing the panel carefully behind him. Would he, or could he thought drearily, get back in Van Ryck's profit column again? Sargol had been unlucky as far as he was concerned. First he had made that stupid mistake, and then he got sick. And now, what was the matter? Was it just the general attack of nerves over the voyage and the commitments which forced their haste, or was it something else? He could not rid himself of a vague sense that the Queen was about to take off into real trouble, and he did not like the sensation at all. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Headaches. They lifted from Sargol on schedule, and went into hyper, also on schedule. From that point on there was nothing to do but wait out the usual dull time of flight between systems, and hope that Steen Wilcox had plotted a course which would cut that flight time to a minimum. But this voyage there was little relaxation once they were in hyper. No matter when Dane dropped into the mess cabin, which was the common meeting place of the spacer, he was apt to find others there before him, usually with a mug of one of Mura's special brews close at hand, speculating about their landing date. Dane himself, once he had thrown off the lingering effects of his Sargolian illness, applied time to his studies. When he had first joined the Queen as a recruit straight out of the training pool, he had speedily learned that all the 10 years of intensive study then behind him had only been an introduction to the amount he still had to absorb before he could take his place as an equal with such a trader as Van Ryck, if he had the stuff which would raise him in time to that exalted level. While he had still had his superior's favor, he had dared to treat him as an instructor, going to him with perplexing problems of stowage or barter. But now he had no desire to intrude upon the cargo master, and doggedly wrestled with the microtapes of old records on his own, painfully working out the why and wherefore for any departure from the regular procedure. He had no inkling of his own future status, whether the return to Terra would find him permanently earthed. He would ask no questions. They had been 4 days of ship's time in Hyper when Dane walked into the mess cabin, tired after his work with old records, to discover no Mura busy in the galley beyond, no brew steaming on the heat coil. Rip sat at the table, his long legs stuck out, his usually happy face very sober. "What's wrong?" Dane reached for a mug, then, seeing no pot of drink, put it back in place. "Frank's sick." "What?" Dane turned. Illness such as they had run into on Sargol had a logical base, but illness on board ship was something else. "Tau has him isolated. He has a bad headache, and he blacked out when he tried to sit up. Tau's running tests." Dane sat down. "Could be something he ate." Rip shook his head. "He wasn't at the feast, remember? And he didn't eat anything from the outside. He swore that to Tau. In fact, he didn't go dirt much while we were down." That was only too true, as Dane could now recall. And the fact that the steward had not been at the feast, had not sampled native food products, wiped out the simplest and most comforting reasons for his present collapse. "What's this about Frank?" Ollie stood in the doorway. "He said yesterday that he had a headache, but now Tau has him shut off. But he wasn't at that feast." Ollie stopped short as the implications of that struck him. "How's Tang feeling?" "Fine. Why?" The comtech had come up behind Camille and was answering for himself. "Why this interest in the state of my health?" "Frank's down with something, in isolation," Rip replied bluntly. "Did he do anything out of the ordinary when we were off ship?" For a long moment the other stared at Shannon and then shook his head. "No, and he wasn't dirt-side to any extent either. So Tau's running tests." He lapsed into silence. None of them wished to put their thoughts into words. Dane picked up the microtape he had brought with him and went on down the corridor to return it. The panel of the cargo office was ajar, and to his relief he found Van Ryck out. He shoved the tape back in its case and pulled out the next one. Sinbad was there, not in his own private hammock, but sprawled out on the cargo master's bunk. He watched Dane lazily, mouthing a silent mew of welcome. For some reason, since they had blasted from Sargol, the cat had been lazy, as if his adventures afield there had sapped much of his vitality. "Why aren't you out working?" Dane asked as he leaned over to scratch under a furry chin raised for the benefit of such a caress. "You inspect the hold lately, boy?" Sinbad merely blinked, and after the manner of his species looked infinitely bored. As Dane turned to go, the cargo master came in. He showed no surprise at Dane's presence. Instead, he reached out and fingered the label of the tape Dane had just chosen. After a glance at the identifying symbol, he took it out of his assistant's hand, plopped it back in its case, and stood for a moment eyeing the selection of past voyage records. With a tongue click of satisfaction, he pulled out another and tossed it across the desk to Dane. "See what you can make out of this tangle," he ordered. But Dane's shoulders went back as if some weight had been lifted from them. The old easiness was still lacking, but he was no longer exiled to the outer darkness of Van Ryck's displeasure. Holding the microtape as if it were a first-grade Koro stone, Dane went back to his own cabin, snapped the tape into his reader, adjusted the ear buttons, and lay back on his bunk to listen. He was deep in the intricacy of a deal so complicated that he was lost after the first 2 moves, when he opened his eyes to see Ollie at the door panel. The engineer apprentice made an emphatic beckoning wave, and Dane slipped off the ear buttons. "What is it?" His question lacked a cordial note. "I've got to have help." Ollie was terse. "Costy's blacked out." "What?" Dane sat up and dropped his feet to the deck in almost one movement. "I can't shift him alone." Ollie stated the obvious. The giant jetman was almost double his size. "We must get him to his quarters, and I won't ask Stotts." For a perfectly good reason, Dane knew. An assistant, 2 of the apprentices, could go sick, but their officers' continued good health meant the most to the Queen. If some infection were aboard, it would be better for Ollie and himself to be exposed than to have Johann Stotts, with all his encyclopedic knowledge of the ship's engines, contract any disease. They found the jetman half sitting, half lying in the short foot or so of corridor which led to his own cubby. He had been making for his quarters when the seizure had taken him, and by the time the 2 reached his side he was beginning to come around, moaning, his hands going to his head. Together they got him on his feet and guided him to his bunk, where he collapsed again, dead weight they had to push into place. Dane looked at Ollie. "Tau?" "Haven't had time to call him yet." Ollie was jerking at the thigh straps which fastened Costy's space boots. "I'll go." Glad for the task, Dane sped up the ladder to the next section and threaded the narrow side hall to the medic's cabin, where he knocked on the panel. There was a pause before Craig Tau looked out, deep lines of weariness bracketing his mouth, etched between his eyes. "Costy, sir." Dane gave his bad news quickly. "He's collapsed. We got him to his cabin." Tau showed no sign of surprise. His hand shot out for his kit. "You touched him?" At the other's nod, he added an order. "Stay in your quarters until I have a chance to look you over. Understand?" Dane had no chance to answer. The medic was already on his way. He went to his own cabin, understanding the reason for his imprisonment, but inwardly rebelling against it. Rather than sit idle, he snapped on the reader. But, although facts and figures were dunned into his ears, he really heard very little. He couldn't apply himself, not with a new spectre leering at him from the bulkhead. The dangers of the space lanes were not to be numbered. Death walked among the stars, a familiar companion of all spacemen. And to the free trader, it was the extra and invisible crewman on every ship that raised. But there were deaths and deaths, and Dane could not forget the gruesome legends Van Ryck collected avidly as his hobby, had recorded in his private library of the folklore of space. Stories such as that of the ghostly New Hope, carrying refugees from the first Martian rebellion, the ship which had lifted for the stars but had never arrived, which wandered for a timeless eternity, a derelict in free-fall, its port closed but the warning deadlights on its nose, a ship which through 5 centuries had been sighted only by a spacer in similar distress. Such stories were numerous. There were other tales of plague ships, wandering free with their dead crews, or discovered and shot into some sun by a patrol cruiser so that they might not carry their infection farther. Plague, the nebulous worst the traders had to face. Dane screwed his eyes shut, tried to concentrate upon the droning voice in his ears, but he could not control his thoughts, nor his fears. At a touch on his arm, he started so wildly that he jerked the cord loose from the reader and sat up, somewhat shamefaced, to greet Tau. At the medic's orders, he stripped for one of the most complete examinations he had ever undergone outside a quarantine port. It included an almost microscopic inspection of the skin on his neck and shoulders, but when Tau had done, he gave a sigh of relief. "Well, you haven't got it. At least you don't show any signs yet." He amended his first statement almost before the words were out of his mouth. "What were you looking for?" Tau took time out to explain. "Here." His fingers touched the small hollow at the base of Dane's throat, and then swung him around and indicated 2 places on the back of his neck and under his shoulder blades. "Costi and Mura both have red eruptions here. It's as if they've been given an injection of some narcotic." Tau sat down on the jump seat while Dane dressed. "Costi was dirtside. He might have picked up something." "But Mura?" "That's it." Tao brought his fist down on the edge of the bunk. "Frank hardly left the ship, yet he showed the first signs. On the other hand, you were all right so far, and you were off ship. And Ollie's clean, and he was with you on the hunt. We'll just have to wait and see." He got up wearily. "If your head begins to ache," he told Dane, "you get back here in a hurry and stay put, understand?" As Dane learned, all the other members of the crew were given the same type of inspection, but none of them showed the characteristic marks which meant trouble. They were on course for Terra, but, and that but must have loomed large in all their minds, once there, would they be allowed to land? Could they even hope for a hearing? Plague ship. Tao must find the answer before they came into normal space about their own solar system, or they were in for such trouble as made a broken contract seem the simplest of mishaps. Costi and Mura were in isolation. There were volunteers for nursing, and Tao, unable to be in 2 places at once, finally picked Weeks to look after his crewmate in the engineering section. There was doubling up of duties. Tao could no longer share with Mura the care of the hydro garden, so Van Ryck took over. While Dane found himself in charge of the galley, and while he did not have Mura's deft hand at disguising the monotonous concentrates to the point they resembled fresh food, after a day or two he began to experiment cautiously and produced a stew which brought some short words of appreciation from Captain Jellicoe. They all breathed a sigh of relief when, after 3 days, no more signs of the mysterious illness showed on new members of the crew. It became routine to parade before Tao, stripped to the waist each morning for the inspection of the danger points, and the medic's vigilance did not relax. In the meantime, neither Mura nor Costi appeared to suffer. Once the initial stages of headaches and blackouts were past, the patients lapsed into a semi-conscious state, as if they were under a sedation of some type. They would eat, if the food was placed in their mouths, but they did not seem to know what was going on about them, nor did they answer when spoken to. Tao, between visits to them, worked feverishly in his tiny lab, analyzing blood samples, reading the records of obscure diseases, trying to find the reason for their attacks. But as yet his discoveries were exactly nothing. He had come out of his quarters and sat in limp exhaustion at the mess table, while Dane placed before him a mug of stimulating calf-hag. "I don't get it." The medic addressed the tabletop rather than the amateur cook. "It's a poison of some kind. Costi went dirtside, Mura didn't. Yet Mura came down with it first. And we didn't ship any food from Sargol. Neither did he eat any while we were there. Unless he did and we didn't know about it. If I could just bring him to long enough to answer a couple of questions." Sighing, he dropped his weary head on his folded arms, and within seconds was asleep. Dane put the mug back on the heating unit and sat down at the other end of the table. He did not have the heart to shake Tao into wakefulness. Let the poor devil get a slice of bunk time. He certainly needed it after the fatigues of the past 4 days. Van Ryck passed along the corridor on his way to the hydro, Sinbad at his heels. But in a moment the cat was back, leaping up on Dane's knee. He did not curl up, but rubbed against the young man's arm, finally reaching up with a paw to touch Dane's chin, uttering one of the soundless mews which were his bid for attention. "What's the matter, boy?" Dane fondled the cat's ears. "You haven't got a headache, have you?" In that second a wild surmise came into his mind. Sinbad had been planet-side on Sargol as much as he could, and on shipboard he was equally at home in all their cabins. Could he be the carrier of the disease? A good idea, only if it were true, then logically the second victim should have been Van, or Dane, whereas Sinbad lingered most of the time in their cabins, not Costi. The cat, as far as he knew, had never shown any particular fondness for the jetman, and certainly did not sleep in Carl's quarters. No, that point did not fit. But he would mention it to Tao. No use overlooking anything, no matter how wild. It was the sequence of victims which puzzled them all. As far as Tao had been able to discover, Mura and Costi had nothing much in common, except that they were crewmates on the same spacer. They did not bunk in the same section. Their fields of labor were totally different. They had no special food or drink tastes in common. They were not even of the same race. Frank Mura was one of the few descendants of a mysterious, or now mysterious, people who had had their home on a series of islands in one of Terra's seas, islands which almost 100 years before had been swallowed up in a series of world-rending quakes. Japan was the ancient name of that nation, while Carl Costi had come from the once thickly populated land masses half the planet away, which had borne the geographical name of Europe. No, all the way along, the two victims had only very general meeting points. They both shipped on the Solar Queen, and they were both of Terran birth. Tao stirred and sat up, blinking bemusedly at Dane, then pushed back his wiry black hair and assumed a measure of alertness. Dane dropped the now purring cat in the medic's lap, and in a few sentences outlined his suspicion. Tao's hands closed about Sinbad. "There's a chance in that." He looked a little less beat, and he drank thirstily from the mug Dane gave him for the second time. Then he hurried out with Sinbad under one arm, bound for his lab. Dane slicked up the galley, trying to put things away as neatly as Mura kept them. He didn't have much faith in the Sinbad lead, but in this case everything must be checked out. When the medic did not appear during the rest of the ship's day, Dane was not greatly concerned. But he was alerted to trouble when Ollie came in with an inquiry and a complaint. "Seen anything of Craig?" "He's in the lab," Dane answered. "He didn't answer my knock," Ollie protested, "and Weeks says he hasn't been in to see Carl all day." That did catch Dane's attention. Had his half-hunch been right? Was Tao on the trail of a discovery which had kept him chained to the lab? But it wasn't like the medic not to look in on his patients. "You're sure he isn't in the lab?" "I told you that he didn't answer my knock. I didn't open the panel." But now Ollie was already in the corridor heading back the way he had come, with Dane on his heels, an unwelcome explanation for that silence in both their minds. And their fears were reinforced by what they heard as they approached the panel, a low moan wrung out of unbearable pain. Dane thrust the sliding door open. Tao had slipped from his stool to the floor. His hands were at his head, which rolled from side to side, as if he were trying to quiet some agony. Dane stripped down the medic's undertunic. There was no need to make a careful examination. In the hollow of Craig Tao's throat was the telltale red blotch. "Sinbad!" Dane glanced around the cabin. "Did Sinbad get past you?" he demanded of the puzzled Ollie. "No, I haven't seen him all day." Yet the cat was nowhere in the tiny cabin, and it had no concealed hiding place. To make doubly sure, Dane secured the panel before they carried Tao to his bunk. The medic had blacked out again, passed into the lethargic second stage of the malady. At least he was out of the pain, which appeared to be the worst symptom of the disease. "It must be Sinbad," Dane said as he made his report directly to Captain Jellicoe. "And yet—" "Yes, he's been staying in Van's cabin," the captain mused. "And you've handled him. He slept on your bunk. Yet you and Van are all right. I don't understand that. Anyway, to be on the safe side, we better find and isolate him before—" He didn't have to underline any words for the grim-faced men who listened. With Tao, their one hope of fighting the disease, gone, they had a black future facing them. they did not have to search for Sinbad. Dane, coming down to his own section, found the cat crouched before the panel of Van Ryck's cabin, his eyes glued to the thin crack of the door. Dane scooped him up and took him to the small cargo space intended for the safeguarding of choice items of commerce. To his vast surprise, Sinbad began fighting wildly as he opened the hatch, kicking and then slashing with ready claws. The cat seemed to go mad, and Dane had all he could do to shut him in. When he snapped the panel, he heard Sinbad launch himself against the barrier as if to batter his way out. Dane, blood welling in several deep scratches, went in search of first aid, but some suspicion led him to pause as he passed Van Ryck's door, and when his knock brought no answer, he pushed the panel open. Van Ryck lay on his bunk, his eyes half closed in a way which had become only too familiar to the crew of the Solar Queen, and Dane knew that when he looked for it, he would find the mark of the strange plague on the cargo master's body. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Plague. Jellicoe and Steen Wilcox pored over the few notes Tao had made before he was stricken, but apparently the medic had found nothing to indicate that Sinbad was the carrier of any disease. Meanwhile, the captain gave orders for the cat to be confined, a difficult task, since Sinbad crouched close to the door of the storage cabin and was ready to dart out when food was taken in for him. Once he got a good way down the corridor before Dane was able to corner and return him to keeping. Dane, Ollie, and Weeks took on the full care of the 4 sick men, leaving the few regular duties of the ship to the senior officers, while Rip was installed in charge of the hydro garden. Mura, the first to be taken ill, showed no change. He was semi-conscious. He swallowed food, if it were put in his mouth. He responded to nothing around him. And Costi, Tao, and Van Ryck followed the same pattern. They still held morning inspection of those on their feet for signs of a new outbreak, but when no one else went down during the next 2 days, they regained a faint spark of hope. Hope which was snapped out when Ollie brought the news that Stotts could not be roused and must have taken ill during a sleep period. One more inert patient was added to the list, and nothing learned about how he was infected, except that they could eliminate Sinbad, since the cat had been in custody during the time Stotts had apparently contracted the disease. Weeks, Ollie, and Dane, though they were in constant contact with the sick men, and though Dane had repeatedly handled Sinbad, continued to be immune. A fact, Dane thought more than once, which must have significance if someone with Tao's medical knowledge had been able to study it. By all rights, they should be the most susceptible, but the opposite seemed true, and Wilcox duly noted that fact among the data they had recorded. It became a matter of watching each other, waiting for another collapse. And they were not surprised when Tang Ya reeled into the mess, his face livid and drawn with pain. Rip and Dane got him to his cabin before he blacked out. But all they could learn from him during the interval before he lost consciousness was that his head was bursting and he couldn't stand it. Over his limp body they stared at one another bleakly. 6 down, Ollie observed, and 6 to go. How do you feel? Tired, that's all. What I don't understand is that once they go into this stupor, they just stay. They don't get any worse, they have no rise in temperature. It's as if they're in a modified form of cold sleep. How is Tang? Rip asked from the corridor. Usual pattern, Ollie answered. He's sleeping. Got a pain, fella? Rip shook his head. Right as a comm unit. I don't get it. Why does it strike Tang, who didn't even hit dirt much, and yet you keep on? Dane grimaced. If we had an answer to that, maybe we'd know what caused the whole thing." Ollie's eyes narrowed. He was staring straight at the unconscious Comtech as if he did not see that supine body at all. "I wonder if we've been salted," he said slowly. "We've been what?" Dane demanded. "Look here, we three, with Weeks, drank that brew of the Salariki, didn't we? And we were as sick as Venusian gobblers afterwards," agreed Rip. Light dawned. "Do you mean—" began Dane. "So that's it," flashed Rip. "It might just be," Ollie said. "Do you remember how the settlers on Cambline brought their Terran cattle through the first year? They fed them salt mixed with fancel grass. The result was that the herds didn't take the fancel grass fever when they turned them out to pasture in the dry season. All right, maybe we had our salt in that drink. The fancel salt makes the cattle filthy sick when it's forced down their throats, but after they recover, they're immune to the fever. And nobody on Cambline buys unsalted cattle now." "It sounds logical," admitted Rip. "But how are we going to prove it?" Ollie's face was black once more. "Probably by elimination," he said morosely. "If we keep our feet and all the rest go down, that's our proof." "But we ought to be able to do something," protested Shannon. "Just how?" Ollie's slender brows arched. "Do you have a gallon of that Salariki brew on board you can serve out? We don't know what was in it, nor are we sure that this whole idea has any value." All of them had had first aid and basic preventive medicine as part of their training, but the more advanced laboratory experimentation was beyond their knowledge and skill. Had Tau still been on his feet, perhaps he could have traced that lead and brought order out of the chaos which was closing in upon the Solar Queen. But, though they reported their suggestion to the captain, Jellicoe was powerless to do anything about it. If the four who had shared that upsetting friendship cup were immune to the doom which now overhung the ship, there was no possible way for them to discover why or how. Ship's time came to have little meaning, and they were not surprised when Steen Wilcox slipped from his seat before the computer, to be stowed away with what had become a familiar procedure. Only Jellicoe withstood the contagion apart from the younger four, taking his turn at caring for the helpless men. There was no change in their condition. They neither roused nor grew worse as the hours and then the days sped by. But each of those units of time in passing brought them nearer to greater danger. Sooner or later they must make the transition out of hyper into system space, and the jump out of warp was something not even a veteran took lightly. Rip's round face thinned while they watched. Jellicoe was still functioning, but if the captain collapsed, the whole responsibility for the snap-out would fall directly on Shannon. An infinitesimal error would condemn them to almost hopeless wandering, perhaps forever. Dane and Ollie relieved Rip of all duty but that which kept him chained in Wilcox's chair before the computers. He went over and over the data of the course the astrogator had set. And Captain Jellicoe, his eyes sunk in dark pits, checked and rechecked. When the fatal moment came, Ollie manned the engine room with Weeks at his elbow to tend the controls the acting engineer could not reach. And Dane, having seen the sick all safely stowed in crash webbing, came up to the control cabin, writing out the transfer in Tang Ya's place. Rip's voice hoarsened into a croak, calling out the data. Dane, though he had had basic theory, was completely lost before Shannon had finished the first set of coordinates. But Jellicoe replied, hands playing across the pilot's board.
"Stand by for snap-out."
The croak went down to the engines where Ollie now held Stoltz's post. "Engines ready," the voice came back, thinned by its journey from the Queen's interior. "Aut 5-9, that was Jellicoe. Dane found himself suddenly unable to watch. He shut his eyes and braced himself against the vertigo of snap-out. It came, and he whirled sickeningly through unstable space. Then he was sitting in the laced Comtech seat looking at Rip. Runnels of sweat streaked Shannon's brown face. There was a damp patch darkening the tunic between his shoulder blades, a patch which it would take both of Dane's hands to cover. For a moment he did not raise his head to look at the vision plate which would tell him whether or not they had made it. But when he did, familiar constellations made the patterns they knew. They were out, and they couldn't be too far off the course Wilcox had plotted. There was still the system run to make, but Snap-out was behind them. Rip gave a deep sigh and buried his head in his hands. With a throb of fear, Dane unhooked his safety belt and hurried over to him. When he clutched at Shannon's shoulder, the astrogator apprentice's head rolled limply. Was Rip down with the illness too? But the other muttered and opened his eyes. "Does your head ache?" Dane shook him. "Head? No." Rip's words came drowsily. "Just sleepy. So sleepy." He did not seem to be in pain, but Dane's hands were shaking as he hoisted the other out of his seat and half carried, half led him to his cabin, praying as he went that it was only fatigue and not the disease. The ship was on auto now until Jellicoe as pilot set a course. Dane got Rip down on the bunk and stripped off his tunic. The fine-drawn face of the sleeper looked wan against the foam rest, and he snuggled into the softness like a child as he turned over and curled up. But his skin was clear. It was real sleep and not the plague which had claimed him. Impulse sent Dane back to the control cabin. He was not an experienced pilot officer, but there might be some assistance he could offer the captain now that Rip was washed out, perhaps for hours. Jellicoe hunched before the smaller computer, feeding pilot tape into its slot. His face was a skull under a thin coating of skin, the bones marking it sharply at jaw, nose, and eye socket. "Shannon down?" His voice was a mere whisper of its powerful self. He did not turn his head. "He's just worn out, sir," Dane hastened to give reassurance. "The marks aren't on him." "When he comes around, tell him the coords are in," Jellicoe murmured. "See he checks the course in 10 hours. "But, sir—" Dane's protest failed as he watched the captain struggle to his feet, pulling himself up with shaking hands. As Thorson reached forward to steady the other, one of those hands tore at tunic collar, ripping loose the ceiling. There was no need for explanation. The red splotch signaled from Jellicoe's sweating throat. He kept his feet, holding out against waves of pain by sheer willpower. Then Dane got a grip on him, got him away from the computer, hoping he could keep him going until they reached Jellicoe's cabin. Somehow they made that journey, being greeted with raucous screams from the Hubat. Furiously Dane slapped the cage, setting it to swinging, and so silencing the creature which stared at him with round, malignant eyes as he got the captain to bed. Only 4 of them on their feet now, Dane thought bleakly as he left the cabin. If Rip came out of it in time, they could land. Dane's breath caught as he made himself face up to the fact that Shannon might be ill, that it might be up to him to bring the Queen in for a landing. And in where? The Terra quarantine was Luna City on the moon. But let them signal for a set down there, let them describe what had happened, and they might face death as a plague ship. Wearily he climbed down to the mess cabin to discover Weeks and Ollie there before him. They did not look up as he entered. "Old man's got it," he reported. "Rip?" was Allie's crossing question. "Asleep. He passed out." "What?" Weeks swung around. "Worn out," Dane amended. "Captain fed in a pilot tape before he gave up." "So, now we are 3, was Ollie's comment. "Where do we set down? Luna City?" "If they let us," Dane hinted at the worst.
"But they've got to let us," Weeks exclaimed. "We can't just wander around out here."
"It's been done," Ollie reminded them brutally, and that silenced Weeks. "Did the old man set Luna?" After a long pause, Ollie inquired. "I didn't check," Dane confessed. "He was giving out, and I had to get him to his bunk." "It might be well to know." The engineer apprentice got up, his movements lacking much of the elastic spring which was normally his. When he climbed to control, both the others followed him. Ollie's slender fingers played across a set of keys, and in the small screen mounting on the computer, a set of figures appeared. Dane took up the master course book, read the connotation, and blinked. "Not Luna?" Ollie asked.
"No, but I don't understand. This must be for somewhere in the asteroid belt."
Ollie's lips stretched into a pale caricature of a smile. "Good for the old man. He still had his wits about him, even after the bug bit him."
"But why are we going to the asteroids?" Weeks asked, reasonably enough. "There are medics at Luna City. They can help us."
"They can handle known diseases," Ollie pointed out. "But what of the code?" Weeks dropped into the Comtex place as if some of the stiffening had vanished from his thin but sturdy legs.
"They wouldn't do that," he protested,
but his eyes said that he knew that they might. They well might. "Oh no? Face the facts, man." Ollie sounded almost savage. "We come from a frontier planet. We're a plague ship." He did not have to underline that. They all knew too well the danger in which they now stood.
"Nobody's died yet."
Weeks tried to find an opening in the net being drawn about them. "And nobody's recovered." Ollie crushed that thread of hope. "We don't know what it is, how it is contracted, anything about it. Let us make a report saying that, and you know what will happen, don't you?" They weren't sure of the details, but they could guess. "So I say," Ollie continued, "the old man was right when he set us on an evasion course. If we can stay out until we really know what is the matter, we'll have some chance of talking over the high brass at Luna when we do planet." In the end, they decided not to interfere with the course the captain had set. It would take them into the fringes of solar civilization, but give them a fighting chance at solving their problem before they had to report to the authorities. In the meantime, they tended their charges, let rip sleep, and watched each other with desperate but hidden intentness, ready for another to be stricken. However, they remained, although almost stupid with fatigue at times, reasonably healthy. Time was proving that their guess had been correct. They had been somehow inoculated against the germ or virus which had struck the ship. Rip slept for 24 hours, ship time, and then came into the mess cabin ravenously hungry, to catch up on both food and news. And he refused to join with the prevailing pessimistic view of the future. Instead, he was sure that their own immunity having been proven, they had a talking point to use with the medical officers at Luna, and he was eager to alter course directly for the quarantine station. Only the combined arguments of the other three made him, unwillingly, agree to a short delay. And how grateful they should be for Captain Jellicoe's foresight they learned within the next day. Ollie was at the comm unit, trying to pick up Solarian news reports. When the red alert flashed on throughout the ship, it brought the others hurrying to the control cabin. The code squeaks were magnified as Ollie switched on the receiver full strength, to be translated as he pressed a second button. "Repeat, repeat, repeat. Free Trader, Solar Queen, Terra Registry, 65724910 JK. Suspected plague ship. Took off from infected planet. Warn off. Warn off. Report such ship to Luna Station. Solar Queen from infected planet. To be warned off and reported." The same message was repeated 3 times before going off ether. The 4 in the control cabin looked at each other blankly.
"But," Dane broke the silence, "how did they know? We haven't reported in."
"The IZs," Ollie had the answer ready. "That IS ship must be having the same sort of trouble and reported to her company. They would include us in their report, and believe that we were infected too. Or it would be easy to convince the authorities that we were."
"I wonder." Rip's eyes narrowed slits as he leaned back against the wall. "Look at the facts. The survey ship which charted Sargol, they were dirtside there about 3-4 months. Yet they give it a clean bill of health and put it up for trading rights auction. Then Cam bought those rights. He made at least 2 trips in and out before he was blasted on Limbo. No infection bothered him or survey."
"But you've got to admit it hit us," Weeks protested.
"Yes, and the IZ ship was able to foresee it, report us before we snapped out of hyper. Sounds almost as if they expected us to carry a plague, doesn't it?" Shannon wanted to know.
"Planted?" Ollie frowned at the banks of controls.
"But how?
No IZ came on board. No Salariki either. Except for the cub who showed us what they thought of catnip."
Rip shrugged. "How would I know how they did?" He was beginning when Dane cut in. "If they didn't know about our immunity, the Queen might stay in hyper and never come out. There wouldn't be anyone to set the snap out." "Right enough. But on the chance that somebody did keep on his feet and bring her home, they were ready with a cover. If no one raises a howl, Sargol will be written off the charts as infected. IS sits on her tail fins a year or so, and then she promotes an investigation before the board. The survey records are trotted out, no infection recorded. So they send in a patrol probe. Everything is all right. So it isn't the planet after all. It was that dirty old free trader. And she's out of the way. IS gets the Koros trade all square and legal, and we're no longer around to worry about. Need as a Salariki netcast, and right around our collective throats, my friends." "So what do we do now?" Weeks wanted to know.
"We keep on the old man's course. Get lost in the asteroids until we can do some heavy thinking and see a way out. But if IS gave us this prize package, some trace of its origin is still aboard. And if we can find out, why, then we have something to start from."
Mura went down first, and then Carl. Nothing in common. The old problem faced Dane for the 100th time.
"No, but—" Ollie arose from his place at the comm unit. "I'd suggest a real search of first Frank's and then Carl's quarters. A regular turnout down to the bare walls of their cabins. Are you with me? Flyboy, we're ahead of you." Rip contributed, already at the door panel. "Down to the bare walls it is." End of Chapter 9.